When I was researching color theory for this video from last month, I discovered two color combinations that I bet you've never heard of. Let's start with split complementary. Here's my cute little party collection color wheel, which I printed at 50% and backed with a magnet to be able to keep it on my swatch board. Split complementary simply means that you start with one color, in this case Rockin red, and then find its complementary, which is Mardi Gras. Then you choose the colors on either side, Lime Rickey and Aquatini. You can even include Mardi Gras so you've got an analogous combination plus the complementary, and it's still considered a split complementary palette. Split complementary forms a triangle on the color wheel, just like a triad, but the distance is not the same between all the colors, resulting in a narrower triangle shape. And an interesting thing is that if you now start with Lime Rickey and create a split complementary palette, it's not going to be the same because of the different distances between the colors on the triangle. So starting with Lime Rickey would give you this combination with Rockin red and Grape Crush. And then if you start with Aquatini, you get Orange Twist and Rockin red, which I used recently as a Christmas color palette. Adding in any of the different values, and by that I mean lighter or darker shades, can also add interest without changing from a split complementary palette. Here's a few variations, both in starting points and values. These use only party collection inks, and of course you can do the same with the spa colors. I love this red, lime, and aqua color combination for Christmas. It adds a little interest and variation to the traditional red and green. I've got the Waffle Flower Duotone Square Stencil here, which I love. These little squares are perfectly spaced so you can create lots of different patterns. I started with Aquatini, and I found that by doing a little circular motion in each grouping of 4 square openings, I could get good coverage and work my way along in an orderly fashion. And if you know me at all, you know I love to do things in an orderly fashion. My next color is Mardi Gras, and I shifted the stencil so that I'll be forming almost a gingham pattern. I've got my cardstock and the stencil on this sticky mat from Brutus Monroe, and I know there's lots of different ones out there, but a sticky mat is my favorite way to hold stencils in place. Now the beauty of this stencil is you can blend it once or twice like this, but you can also shift it again and fill it in further, like I'm doing with Lime Rickey. Now at this point, that right side of the stencil does not have a lot of contact with the sticky mat, so I do really have to hold it in place. And I chose this order of colors, the Aquatini, Mardi Gras, and then the lime, before red to minimize the amount of stencil cleaning I would need to do. Isn't it funny how laziness can make you so efficient? And now a final shift of the stencil to fill in with the Rockin red. I ended up turning the whole sticky mat so I could keep a good grip on that side of the stencil that isn't sticking down as much to the mat, and I finished it all off. And now here's the big reveal. It's a fun, whimsical, and yet still kind of rustic looking pattern that's a perfect background for a Christmas card. But change the colors and this will work for any time of year. This is exactly why I love geometric basics like this stencil so much. I've trimmed the panel with a rectangle die, and I noticed that I did have a couple of little boo-boos down here where the stencil lifted at one point, and I'll just keep that in mind as I decide how to position the panel when I finish the card. But one great way to hide little things like this is to add some splatter. I pulled out my Altenew metallic watercolors, spritzed some water into one of the golds, and then used a brush to add some splatter. Of course, Christmas is a great time for shimmer and shine. Next, to keep my sentiment all matchy-matchy, I painted that same gold watercolor onto the shadow portion of the Pink and Main Merry Christmas die set. To finish the card, I cut a circle from the center of the plaid panel and replaced it with a circle cut from a red panel. My Essential Circles dies cut a narrow frame, and that leaves a nice white border around the red circle at about the same width as the scripty sentiment lines. The Essential Rectangles also cut frames, so I had a red frame from the other panel and I placed it around the plaid. I let the gold splatter be my embellishment, and this is a nice flat card for mailing. And of course I used that plaid circle and the remainder of the red panel to create another card. I used a new Altenew 3D embossing folder on the red panel. It has a similar squares and a diagonal pattern to the stencil work, and it adds some dimension and interest to all that red. I put the plaid circle and frame in place, and I used a simple white Merry Christmas die cut from Paper Rose Studio. When I've done a lot of work on a background panel, I always like to get more than one card from it, and this simple layout works really well for that. The second color combination that I bet you've never seen is a rectangle or double complementary. This color wheel has a label for tetrad, which is a square, and the colors are evenly spaced on the wheel. This is 2 sets of complementary colors. By making two of the sides of the square shorter, you get a rectangle or double complementary color combination. You still have two sets of complementary colors, but they're slightly closer to each other on the color wheel. Here's a bunch of rectangle combinations that I stamped out in my swatch library using Catherine's swatching stamp sets. I'm going to use this last palette to make a couple of cards. In my research, I read that for this type of palette to work well, it's good to choose one main color and use the others as highlights or accents. First, I feel like the purple doesn't really fit in with the other three colors, so it's an easy decision for me that that's one of the colors I'll use only as an accent. I'm starting by creating some colored cardstock with the other three colors by swiping my ink pads directly onto white cardstock. I prefer to do this to save space from storing lots of colored cardstock, but the trade-off is that I have to have the ink refills on hand because this direct-to-paper technique does use quite a bit of ink, as you can imagine. It's easiest if your ink pads are full and juicy, and don't worry about the streaks and stripes. They'll smooth out and dry back as the ink dries on the cardstock. To add some interest and dimension to the colors, I'm going to try blending them together. I've cut the glitz panel in two so I can do one with flame and the other with dress blues. These are still a little streaky because they're not quite dry, and that's actually going to help with the ink blending. I blended flame from both sides, letting it fade into the center to create a nice variation and glow from the glitz. I moved on to adding dress blues to the glitz, and of course that created a kind of green. These are looking like lovely fall colors. See how you're not seeing any imperfections in the panel now? This will continue to smooth even more as it dries. Initially, I wasn't sure what to blend the flame with to add the dimension, so I just added another layer of flame. This works pretty well, but the drama of the two glitz panels made me think that this won't be enough. I'll come back to that. For the dress blues, I blended the grape crush on the edges. This doesn't really change the color or even add much purple, but it does deepen the edges and give it a bit of a glow. So then I wondered about adding the grape crush to the flame panel. These two colors are not complements. Blue would be the complement to the orangey flame color, but they are pretty close, so I wasn't sure how muddy the result would be. But look at it, I love it. It's giving me a rich purpley red, and it's definitely playing into my fall color scheme. So I'm making one mostly red card and one mostly blue card using the other colors as highlights and showing how even with one color palette, you can get very different looks. I've got this paper rose set of layered chevron dies that has 3 different sizes and finishes. They fit together well, and in fact I taped them together for die cutting, and that gave me more skinny chevrons from the in-between bits. I cut up my colored panels, and I also cut some chevrons from some honey gold satin cardstock, which has a wonderful glow rather than a mirror shine or sparkle. Then I built my card panels. As I said earlier, I made one that was mostly that reddish-orange flame color, and then another one that was mostly the blue. I built both panels by putting lots of tape runner onto a piece of scrap paper and then adding the chevrons in the pattern I had laid out, trying my best to just keep it all straight. Using thin backing paper makes it easier later when I use a rectangle die to trim the panel and clean up the edges, but you could use regular cardstock as your backer to build up dimension if you wanted. You just might have to use your trimmer to create the rectangle if your die can't cut through 2 layers of cardstock. You can see that by choosing a main color and using the others as accents, they do seem to work well together. And so maybe rectangle is a great thing to know about when you want, say, mostly a red card, but not totally red. And this gives you ideas for what other colors can work well with your main color. When the blue panel was finished and cut, I noticed that a tiny piece of cardstock was lost from the corner in the cutting process, and I could see the backing paper. I just grabbed a Copic marker in a similar color and I colored it, and I'll make sure that that corner is on the bottom of the card when it's finished. No one's ever going to notice. I cut my 2 sentiments from the gold cardstock as well, but since I knew I wanted to stack them up and make them a little more dimensional, I cut them from white cardstock as well. And since I could only cut one at a time, I used some of those passes through the die cutting machine to create lots of other die cuts to have on hand for stacking sentiments for future cards. And speaking of leftovers, I had a couple of extra gold chevrons, and while I can keep those for future cards, I figured I may as well add them in here if I could. I stacked the middle pierced one over the widest one on the blue card, and then I offset the narrowest one on the red card to create a little pattern of squares, which is kind of fun. But what about the purple? Yes, there's a bit on the flame chevrons and also on the blue chevrons, but I also knew I had the perfect gems. They're called Purple Dream from Crafty Meraki, and they flash purple and blue depending on the light, and I think they work really well. I think that the depth of the colors and the geometric feel of the chevrons make these panels perfect for masculine cards, but like the stencil in my previous cards, these geometric basics can work for anyone at any time of year. Triad, split complementary, tetrad, double complementary, it all feels very scientific, doesn't it? I think it's good to have all this knowledge and understanding of how colors can work together, but I'm more likely to continue taking a more instinctive approach to choosing my colors by finding inspiration I like and matching them to the inks that I have. What about you? Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.